ladies and gentlemen, I think this is probably the right moment to get started. Good evening to all of you. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Peter Jennings, Executive Director of ASPI, and welcome to the launch of ASPI's new strategy report by Professor Paul Dibb, Why Russia is a Threat to the International Order. I trust everyone's been able to pick up a copy. Now, Paul will be well known to many of you, and those of you who know him know that he's never one to mince his words, hence the title of the strategy. And in it, he sets out very clearly the purpose of the paper. He says in his introduction, almost a quarter of a century after the demise of the USSR, Russia is back on the world stage, and in a familiar, threatening manner. Some are describing the resurgence of Russia as a return to a new Cold War. Others are predicting a coming war with Russia. And so what Paul does in this study is to analyse Russia's geopolitical ambitions, its military modernisation, the threat that it poses to the international order, and how the West should respond. The paper estimates the prospects for the Russian economy to assess how economic weakness might impact Russian behaviour. And it concludes also by addressing Moscow's strategic priorities in the Asia-Pacific region and the implications of Russia's rise for Australia. Now, just a few weeks ago, Paul led a senior delegation of researchers to Russia to make an assessment of the current situation. And Admiral Chris Barry, former chief of the Australian Defence Force, was a member of that team. Chris has also very generously offered to step in at rather late notice to be a speaker this evening because the Norwegian ambassador, who's a good friend of ASPI, unfortunately fell ill and was unable to attend this evening. So we're going to hear from three speakers, and the order of proceedings is that I will ask our three speakers to talk first for roughly speaking, a crisp and disciplined 10 minutes each on what they would like to say about Russian matters. We'll then go to questions and some discussion and break around 6:35 for our famous ASPI drinks and snacks, to which you will all be very welcome. So let me now, I'll introduce our three speakers together and then ask each of them to come to the podium to make their remarks. Paul Dibb's career began as a student of Soviet economic geography, and then he spent nearly 2 decades in Australian Defence Intelligence, including service as head of the Joint National Assessment Staff in the Joint Intelligence Organisation from 1974 to 78, Deputy Director of JIO 1978 to 80. He was a ministerial consultant to the Minister for Defence Kim Beazley 86 to 88, and Deputy Secretary of Defence for Strategy and Intelligence in 1988 to 91. From then he became Professor of the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre at the ANU, and he is still an Emeritus Professor at the ANU. Paul is known for many things, but not least of which are the production of 2 books, The Soviet Union, The Incomplete Superpower, which was produced in 1986, the first edition, the same year as his review of Australia's defence capabilities. Our second speaker will be Paul Myler, who is the Assistant Secretary, Strategic Issues and Intelligence in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, a role in which Paul advises the government on strategic issues including cyber, space and maritime security policy. And he's also responsible for managing the DFAT's relationships with defence and the intelligence community. Paul was, until March of this year, ambassador to the Russian Federation, and interestingly, not only ambassador to the Russian Federation, but also to a significant list of countries: Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Armenia, Moldova, and Belarus. And what did you do in your spare time, Paul? tells you something about how small our overseas diplomatic footprint can be. Paul has had 20 years' experience with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. He's also served as Chief of Staff to Martin Ferguson when he was Minister for Resources, Energy and Tourism. Chris Barry retired from active service in the Royal Australian Navy and as the Chief of Defence Force in 2002. Since then, Chris has concentrated in his work on strategic leadership issues, including involvement every year with the Oxford Strategic Leadership and Stimulus Program, the Young Strategic Leaders Forum in Australia, and teaching an elective on strategic leadership to US military officers at the US National Defence University in Washington, DC. As Chief of Defence Force, Chris directed and commanded the operation to secure East Timor in 1999 to 2000, and also provided specialist defence security support to the Sydney Olympic Games in 2000 and to the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting at Coolum in 2002. He was responsible for advising the government on specific roles relating to Australia's armed forces in support of coalition operations in Afghanistan and elsewhere after the 9/11 tragedy, and responsible for the military response to the invocation of assistance to the United States government under the ANZUS Treaty in 2001. So we have a very distinguished panel of speakers who are going to talk about, I guess we should say, Paul's his new strategy contribution. And I think firstly, can I ask you to welcome Paul Dibb.
Thank you, Peter, and thanks to ASPI for the tremendous support that you've given me in this fairly drawn-out process. I'd also like to acknowledge the tremendous cooperation of our ambassador in Moscow, Peter Tesh, where the Admiral and I and Michael Wesley and Richard Rigby and Kyle Wilson spent a week in Moscow 3 weeks ago. And I'd also like to acknowledge the strong cooperation of the Russian ambassador, Ambassador Morozov, and I'd like to acknowledge the presence here of 2 members of the embassy. I'm facing mission impossible that Peter has set me 10 minutes to describe 10,000 words excluding annexes, but let's have a go. Before I start, there's a couple of sort of, if you like, as we academics would say, conceptual issues that I want you to hold in mind. The first one is that we're in a new period of the international strategic order, in which the re-rise of Russia and the emergence of China, 2 continental-sized authoritarian countries, are challenging the established liberal international order led by the United States, the maritime alliance of which we are a part. And I think not enough attention is being given to that incredible new development, let alone the fact that the liberal international order is in deep trouble. In the United States, in the UK, where I've just come from, where my part of England voted 60% to get out. And England, as usual, was split geopolitically on this issue. Secondly, if I used one sentence to describe the week that Chris and I spent at high-level talks in Russia, it is as follows. In Russia, much has changed, and so much has not. The changes are there for any of you to see. The emergence of capitalism, efficient, cooperative services in hotels and restaurants, the like of which you didn't get in the Cold War. And on the other hand, attitudes that we experience to the international situation that have, if not a ring of the Cold War, reflect the fact that Russia, perhaps more than any other country in the world, in my view, is a prisoner of its history, its geography and its culture. I'll leave you with those 2 thoughts. First then quickly, Putin's Russia and his attitude to the post-Soviet space. I think Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin is a leader not to be underrated, as some in this country seem to think. I think he's going to be around for quite a while. And as the former head of MI6, a fellow graduate of Nottingham University, John Sawers, has recently said, don't think if and when Putin goes that it might be any better. Just don't presume that. I think Putin is angry still, for reasons I do understand, about the carve-up of the Soviet Union. He uses phrases like, they came and robbed us. We all have our views, not least, by the way, people from Ukraine about these attitudes. But in some ways we brought this on ourselves by encouraging NATO to expand to the very borders of the Soviet strategic space. Others in this audience will have a different view about that, and I acknowledge that. But just be very careful. Anglo-Saxon countries like Australia, New Zealand, the UK, surrounded by water, do not know what it's like to share a common border. Do not know. I'm not saying he's seeking by military power to recover the Soviet strategic space. The Crimean case may have been sui generis. The situation in Ukraine is locked into a sort of freeze situation, but he's not going to get out in a hurry. There are large numbers of Russians living in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus, Moldavia, and Kazakhstan, particularly northern Kazakhstan. And Putin makes it very clear, in the event that they are threatened, he will do something about it. And you have to understand now, there's a second correction I need to make to some of the predominant views in this town, including in our policy communities, and that is Russia is finished for all time. A very senior colleague of mine said that just a few years ago. Oh, really? Oh, really? Never mind Crimea and Ukraine. Look at what Putin did in Syria when Barack Obama said Putin would be locked in there forever and they wouldn't do much. They did a great deal in 5 months. They were mounting 50 airstrikes a day when America and Australia were mounting 7. They were launching surface-to-surface supersonic Club cruise missiles out of where? The Caspian Sea. Have we ever thought of that? No, we had not. He was launching cruise missiles out of submerged Kilo-class submarines. Now, you may or may not approve of the accuracy or lack of accuracy with those airstrikes. The fact is, he all of a sudden, for the first time since the end of the Soviet Union, used military power outside of the former Soviet geopolitical space, and he used it decisively, and he now has a chair at the table of all negotiations on Syria and the Middle East. So don't tell me, they're finished for all time. They were never finished for all time, because even at the very weakness, when the Soviet Union in 91, its GDP collapsed by 40% overnight, poverty and misery were deeply entrenched, and there was no Western Marshall Plan to help them, none, and I think that was another mistake. The fact was, even at that time, the Russians had over 7,000 strategic nuclear warheads and are the only country in the world, not China, capable of eliminating the United States with nuclear weapons. Now we have a situation where I will not argue that Russian military power is back to Soviet military power. It is not, but it still has 7,000 or 8,000 strategic nuclear warheads, large numbers of tactical nuclear missiles that NATO no longer has, for all practical purposes. And according to studies made in the West that I respect, without any intelligence warning, Russia can now deploy 150,000 troops in any of the near abroad. 150,000. At the time of Ukraine, he had a nationwide, including Siberia exercise involving 150,000 people and 40,000 on the border. They are figures we cannot comprehend, and neither can Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. Russia now has, in the last 2 years, a new doctrine towards tactical nuclear weapons, which goes, in the event that Russia faces an overwhelming conventional force, meaning NATO, on Russian territory, however you define that, it will have early recourse to the de-escalatory use of nuclear weapons. It's a nice phrase. So if you use a nuclear weapon, a tactical one, then you say to NATO, what are you going to do? Because NATO, for all practical purposes, has no tactical nuclear weapons. So what do? Escalate to the strategic level. Now, Dmitry Trenin, who was one of the experts in Russia about matters nuclear, says, oh, we would just bang off a tactical nuclear weapon in a remote part of Russia. Yeah, right. The issue of how should the West respond, including militarily, is a vexed question, and I have no smart answers, frankly, because representatives from European countries here will probably violently disagree with what I'm about to say. Who actually believes that Russians or French are going to fight, that Germans or French are going to fight Russians over the Baltic countries? Well, in theory, if one of the Baltic countries is invaded by Russia to secure its citizens, and that country invokes Article 5, Article 5 had better see NATO, and not just America, involved, otherwise NATO will be finished. Will be finished for all practical purposes. I think Putin has a dismissive attitude to Europe. He thinks they're weak, and the Brexit vote will only confirm his view. And again, I'm appalled by some of the so-called commentators like Sheridan, who could only talk about the bulldog Britain has roared, and has not even mentioned or addressed the fact that for Russia, this is the beginning of the end of the EU. Now, it may or it may not be. What we're talking about is perceptions in Moscow of what this means. The embassy has just given me some words that Putin has said, and he said that the referendum campaign in England and subsequent results point to the British government's self-assuredness and supercilious attitude to life-changing decisions in their own country and Europe in general. He about got that right, I think. And he said it was inappropriate for Russia to try and attempt to influence public opinion in any country, but that as far as Russia is concerned, it does not expect a global upheaval over Brexit, but he'd like to reiterate that if our partners in Europe are ready for constructive dialogue about sanctions, now's the time. So, you know, he's, as we would say in Yorkshire, he's a Bobby Dazzler. You never underrate him. And I've got, my Russian, as the embassy knows, is not all that good, but I picked this up in one of the Golden Ring cities, Vladimir and Suzdal, and there's a photograph there of Putin, and forgive my Russian, it says, "Всё будет путем." Everything can be fixed by Putin?
No, путем, that means everything will be okay.
Will be okay.
Just the same sound as his
As
surname.
say, yeah, Putin, Putin. Thank you, thank you. There are some in America who say that they should supply tactical nuclear weapons with joint action keys to Poland. Oh, really? I mean, again, with respect to any people from Poland here, that would not be a responsible attitude. So I have no smart answers except to say it's not looking brilliant. Quickly turning to Russia's priorities in Asia, my view is that there is a shift that is not popular throughout Russia, including by some former very senior intelligence officers I talked to, the turn away from Europe to Asia. Traditionally, and when you visit Russia, they are European people. That's where they focus, and that's where the weight and throw weight of their military modernization is. However, you need to know that there is a fashionable trend in Russia about a concept called Eurasia. We Russians are not European or Asian. We're something special and exceptional, including our Orthodox faith, which Chris and I saw in a church on a Sunday afternoon in Red Square. Religion is back in a big, big way, and it identifies Russia as the third Rome. The first Rome is those decadent Roman Catholics, the second one is those useless people in Constantinople, and the third one is the true one. So this Eurasian concept, I've read some books by Alexander Danilevsky, Lev Gumilyov, and Alexander Dugin, and they really are quite rabid geopolitical tracks in which those who own the heartland of Siberia and Central Asia, here comes Mackinder, will have the future world authority. And some of those writings talk about a future war with Europe. How far people like Dugan and others go to influence Putin, I'd be interested in some comments from people who might know. I don't think we should exaggerate Russia's interests and capacity to influence things in Asia. They've got the relationship with China above all else, and that makes them a junior partner in that relationship. India's turned into weapon systems from the United States, in my view. There is no peace treaty with Japan over the Northern Territories. And in the 10 years I've been working with foreign affairs in the ASEAN Regional Forum, particular group I work with, the Russian representation changes every year and only very occasionally has had any influence or impact. The weakness of the Russian economy, I'm often asked, you know, am I too confident about Russia's re-emergence? Isn't the economy in deep trouble? It is the world's largest oil and natural gas exporter. We know now there is a surplus of world oil and natural gas. Those exports account for 40% of the Russian federal budget. The economy contracted by 4.6% last year. Inflation is up 15%, some of which is caused by sanctions. Chris will remember our Russian guide up at Vladimir Suzdal told us the price of vegetables and fruit have increased by 30%. You know, a non-trivial example. Nobody's arguing that it's going to quickly come back to a strong economy. It's a petro economy, far too dependent on resources, but it is a highly educated society that still produces very capable military weapons. Do not underestimate that. Better than a lot of the Chinese stuff. Who does China depend upon for high-performance military jet engines? Russia. Why? Because China has been unable to develop a high-performance military jet engine. So other than oil, gas and weapon systems, Russia is struggling. But my bottom line is don't take false comfort from that. Everything I know about the Russian people and their history tells me they are tough, they can withstand arduous times, as they did in the Second World War, when you may recall they lost 29 million dead. Okay, there's a middle class now that know what it's like to be overseas and so on, but Putin is appealing to their sense of Russianness. That Russia is under threat from the United States and NATO. They're on our very borders. They're on our very borders. Why are they doing that to us? So I don't take any comfort from the weakness. In fact, everything I know about Russia tells me the weaker the economy is, the more Putin might lash out. Finally, looking at the time, implications for Australia. My very good friend Brendan Nicholson, he's here somewhere, wrote a very good short piece. Hi, Brendan. It's always difficult to explain in such a short phrase what I'm about. As he points out, I'm not saying with regard to the contingency of one of the Baltic countries and Russia and the use of military power that we should be developing a force structure to contribute to that. That would distort our own force structure, in my view. We would have some capability, but we're talking about high-intensity warfare here, serious high intensity, which could well go nuclear. So I'm not arguing that we should be structuring, but I am arguing who in this town has given thought to the fact that if a member of NATO, say Estonia, a democracy, invokes Article 5, and we are a strategic partner of NATO, Peter? A what? An enhanced partner. Are we going to say no? Well, we all know what Tony Abbott would have done. We'd have put one div there, you know. Show them some Anzac cold steel. But seriously, we need to think what our response would be. And I don't think we've thought about it at all. There's one sentence in the white paper on Russia. Secondly, in the event of such a conflict, mark my words, the United States would drop the pivot to Asia. It would have to. All resources would have to be fighting a non-trivial conflict with a great power, Dejava, Russia. And that would then mean that the pivot to Asia for us, at the very least, would be in question. Secondly, in any case, you remember what I said at the very beginning about the emergence of two great continental authoritarian powers, the other one, China, will be encouraged by any steps Russia can make in places like Crimea and Ukraine with regard to the South China Sea. And we need to think very carefully about that. And finally, there's the issue I've already mentioned, that Russia now is supplying more advanced weapons, air defense systems, high-performance fighter aircraft, missile systems, than it did before this disintegration of their relationship, Russian relationship with the West. We're going to see more of those weapons supplied with less Russian inhibitions. And we need to ask ourselves, what does that mean for our defense forces' traditional margin of technological superiority? We'll still have some weapons systems that will be very impressive, but we need to think carefully and monitor through our intelligence agencies what it means. Final word. One of the disturbing things that came up, and we all agreed on in our discussions, the former foreign minister and president of the Russian International Affairs Council who hosted us, Igor Ivanov, was not there, but he has written about, and Chris will remember some of the other very senior Russians, including former heads of intelligence, KGB were there, said, and I quote, "The mechanisms for dialogue and communication between Russia and America used in the Cold War have fallen into disuse, full stop. This is dangerous." And I think that is dead right. We've forgotten in the Cold War, there were, in the most difficult periods, the Americans and the Russians had regular nuclear arms control and disarmament talks, SALT 1, SALT 2, INF, intrusive on-ground inspections, what was called portal gate inspections for ICBMs, very intrusive. Now there are none. There was also sending signals, as Coral Bell would say, with regard to the central balance between the Soviet Union and the United States. There is no signaling now. And there used to be people like Kissinger and Brzezinski and Primakov and Dobrynin who used to proselytize the need for discussion. We have lost that. And to quote another of our Russian interlocutors, and I quote, "We have lost this sense of fear and responsibility that we had in the Cold War." Thank you.
And now let's go straight to Paul Dibb.
Okay, well, as always, a hard act to follow. I should open by saying, obviously, we're in caretaker, so I won't speak as the Australian government in any sense. I'll just reflect on my time and give you what personal insights I might have on Russia at present, or at least 10 minutes of it. The first thing I think it's really important to be very clear about is that everything that Putin does is driven solely by domestic considerations. Nothing is driven by international considerations, in my view. And I'll even talk about Ukraine and Crimea in that context. Crimea would not have happened if there'd been any other outcome for Yanukovych other than fleeing across the border. It was the act of running which forced Putin's hand. It was a signal that he had to send both to the international community and to his domestic audience that he would never turn and run. Okay, that moment of weakness, which Putin had been advising Yanukovych against, there'd been graduating levels of advice towards the Ukrainian leadership at that stage, that the Maidan needed to be put down. And when ultimately Yanukovych wasn't personally strong enough, shall we say, hard enough to do that, and then ultimately fled, Putin had to demonstrate that he was hard enough to do it and would not tolerate it. So you saw a couple of things. You saw the Crimea exercise, which was spectacular in its effectiveness, almost entirely bloodless. Everybody knew what role they had to play. All the Ukrainian troops, except for one base, signed over to the Russian army immediately. This was well executed, well planned, on the shelf, ready to go, and they performed it beautifully. Unfortunately, the enthusiasm and the nationalism and the vigour that was whipped up by that led the Kremlin to think that there was a receptive audience amongst Russian-speaking peoples in the Donbass, and it became pretty evident pretty quickly that there wasn't. Most of the time, the protests that were able to be mustered in eastern Ukraine were about 20,000 people, 30,000 people. These are in cities of millions, populations of millions. Simply could not get the same response in the Donbass as he got in Crimea, and ultimately had to send in all of the surrogates that we saw go in from the GRU and etc. So, but the key point is the only reason that happened, I mean, it may have been something that they'd wanted to do. They obviously planned to do it, but the only reason it happened at that stage was Putin had to show he would never turn and run. And I argue that everything that he does is for domestic reasons. You have to look at it in that context. This is the reason he has to do this is that without a system of real contestable politics, to keep people engaged and to maintain popularity, you need to mobilise. You need to continuously mobilise the electorate to keep them supportive and engaged in the political process. So we see mobilisation around Russian values. We see mobilisation against the LGBT community. We see mobilisation in favour of the Sochi Olympics. We see, you know, obviously the Crimea was a spectacular mobilisation campaign. The centenary of not the centenary, the 70th anniversary of World War II all through 2015. Again, spectacular mobilisation campaign, keeping people engaged. Syria was an interesting one. Syria was primarily Putin's attempt to break out of Obama's characterisation of Russia as a regional power. And you'll remember that the Minsk process, the Normandy process, the US wasn't there. Russia was left to discuss the future of Europe with France and Germany. So, I mean, rule out France. He really was left just talking it with Germany. The fact that the US was not there grated hugely on the Kremlin. This was something that, you know, regularly came up very, very quietly. You know, don't you want to participate in this? No, it's fine, France and Germany are handling it. You know, why don't you want to participate? So, finally, to force the meeting with Obama at UNGA, Putin goes into Syria. Okay, Putin goes into Syria. This is an interesting moment because it worked. He got his meeting with Obama. But what was interesting was there wasn't the mobilisation campaign ready to go. They didn't have the public line on why they were there, right? So you see for about a week they explore different lines. We're there because orthodoxy is under attack from ISIS. They try different lines until finally they realise that it's we're there because the US can't do the job right line. And then that ramps up, and all of a sudden Syria becomes a popular campaign amongst the Russian people. For the first 2 weeks, Syria was not a popular campaign amongst the Russian people. As soon as you get this idea that, you know, for Christ's sake, the US and their allies have been there for over a year and they've achieved nothing, we're going to send our boys in and they're going to achieve, then it becomes a popular war. I have some disagreement, or not disagreement perhaps, but I would highlight that I'm much more comfortable with the rules of engagement and targeting of the US and Australian, US and associated bombings, where, you know, even if we were only doing 7 sorties a day rather than 60 or whatever it is. I mean, you know, the indiscriminate bombing of civilians and just the complete disregard for normal targeting requirements and rules of engagement and the like, which we saw the Russians, was quite horrific. And I had Russian defence analysts tell me in Moscow that a lot of it was about clearing out old munitions. Because if you've got lots of old munitions in a warehouse that are near their use-by date, you've either got to spend a lot of money making them safe, or you chuck them out the back of a plane. And in large part, they chose to chuck them out the back of a plane. There's also a lot to be said for proving, as a commercial reality, proving weapons on the battlefield, hence the cruise missile strike. I mean, there was absolutely no doubt that was mainly about sales. There's no military reason why you would use cruise missiles in that way. The targets, I mean, ISIS doesn't have the sort of hardened targets that you use a cruise missile against. They're just sitting around in hotel buildings and the like. This was all about marketing. It was all about, this is the first time we've used them, they worked, blah, blah, blah. Now, about 20% of them failed. Iran probably had some quiet words to say about that. So I wouldn't necessarily be buying one with a 20% failure rate, but that was what it was about. Now, we're very difficult. What's the time? Probably getting close to where I should be quiet. What I would say, so a couple of points of difference, and maybe these can be topics for the discussion. I don't for a minute believe that we brought it on ourselves in any other way other than that we considered that Russia was going to geostrategically shrink. We thought there was an inevitability about them becoming less geostrategically important, and frankly China was expanding at the same time, and we all shifted our attention. I'm not somebody who says necessarily a Marshall Plan was required. Frankly, the Russia at the end of the Soviet Union wasn't in the same state as Germany was, or there hadn't been a military war that decimated the means of production. So I'm not as convinced, and I think there was a lot of people trying very hard, but I do think we took our eye off the ball. I absolutely agree with Paul that Putin is the best Russian president we could want, in the sense that the only way that we're going to get a new Russian president is if somebody can quietly unite the military, the security services and the business oligarchs without the president detecting that. And anybody who can do that, we don't want to meet. Okay, so we definitely don't want to meet. But President Putin is genuinely popular, and he is a brilliant retail politician in a country where he doesn't need to be a retail politician. I mean, you can't underestimate the fact that he can read a person beautifully. He knows in the time it takes him to walk across the room, he knows how to deal with them. He knows what to say to them. He knows how to treat them, and he can manipulate them beautifully. It's part of his training, but he's very good at it. I do think myself that mechanisms for dialogue are there. The reality is that every time that we needed to make contact, we could. It's not as institutional. I think the institutional dialogue is broken at the moment, but there was never a stage where, amongst say talking about the Five Eyes countries, where we couldn't get right into the inner circle of the Kremlin. When we needed to. So looking forward, I suppose, what would I say? I think Australia's position has to be something like strategic patience with attitude. We need to continue to be fairly robust in our dealings with Russia, but we don't need to, but patience is going to be a key thing. Our focus, frankly, should still remain on China. But the way we treat Russia is important for our relationship with China. I mean, the sanctions that flowed from Crimea were essential, I think, not so much for Russia, but for China. It's important that we can signal that we are willing to take economic loss ourselves in defence of the international order. And I do think that, there will need, the economy is so bad, and there's no sign that oil prices will turn around at all, which is what Russia has been banking on. So I do think that there will be an opening for a de-escalation, provided, as I think you said in your paper, it's not perceived as in any sense as a sign of weakness or retreat. I might leave it there, and then we can get on with some of that in the questions.
Right, well, I have the privilege of having had 2 hours in which to read the paper. So what I'm about to say to you is just an amalgam of some perceptions, and to say, in the skim of the paper that I've made, what I certainly take from it is worthy of a very detailed read, because I think there's a lot of stuff in there that we do need to understand. The second thing I want to do is simply thank the team at the Russian Embassy and Ambassador Morozov for the opportunity to go to Moscow. And the reason I say that was that back in 1965, when I studied Russian for a year, there was no chance I was ever going to get anywhere near Holy Mother Russia. And I did that in the UK, and it was a time when we studied not just the language but the culture as well, and I found it utterly fascinating. So it's actually been on my agenda for over 50 years. And so I went with Paul Dibb and the others of our ANU delegation with my eyes opened to have a look. The other part of that story is that my wife Maxine had 2 years working in the former Soviet Union between 1979 and 1981. And when we agreed to go on the trip, she decided she didn't need to go for just a week if I was going to work. But the day before I left, she said, "I missed this opportunity, and it's your fault. I should have insisted." So, where do I come at? Well, I'm not going to go over anything that you've heard. What I am going to do is look at this from a strategic perspective. And I do so from a time in 2005 when I was teaching courses at the National Defence University in Washington DC on strategic leadership. And in the course of that program, we pick each semester a live leadership case study, and in 2005 our live leadership case study was Vladimir Putin. And what is fascinating to me, looking back over the last 11 years, is how much has changed. The Putin that we talked about in 2005, I think, is quite different to the Putin we see today. And that just reminds me that we ought not to take too much comfort from the fact that things will stay as they are, but things are evolving and they will change. My strategic nose tells me we're in an era of enormous uncertainty. And, the Brexit vote tells us this is true. Recent events, as you've heard, tells us this is true. I pick up a map like the one in Paul's report and think to myself, there's an enormous country called Russia with internal lines that has huge capability if it puts its mind to it. And we should never forget that. And as Paul Dibb reminds us, the existential threats of significant nuclear capability should never be underestimated, and how that might play out in the power games of the future. One of the perceptions I gained in those studies over 51 years ago was the toughness of the Russian people. And I was reminded of that during the visit to Moscow when, with a young woman who was our tour operator, she told us that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, 10 million Russians committed suicide. Now that is an enormous figure. I don't know whether it's right or not, but I was sitting there thinking about what that would mean in any of our societies and saying to myself, I'm not sure we would understand how that would play were we to go through that sort of experience. There is, in the visit that I saw, 6 days, pride in the country. And I think that reinforces what Peter said to us. Domestic politics, the strong leader. Frankly, I think our failure to help the Russian people when they were going through a period of enormous uncertainty, and we could have done a lot better. We didn't. I think that manifest sense of triumphalism is going to cost us big time. What worries me about future strategy is Russia is a member of the P5, a strong country, used to throwing its weight round, making sure it gets counted, and I think that's reinforced by what you've heard here tonight. Working with China, a rising power, trying to find a way to secure its place in the future world. I don't think they're not sweethearts, so it's not that close, but they are working together. They do see mutual benefit. And if you add, again, back to that map, yellow and red together, it's a big lump, a very big lump. Now I couple that with conversations I have with former friends and colleagues in the United States about an unwillingness to take on the big stuff, an unwillingness to be prepared to meet some of these challenges, and an unwillingness to change the agenda. So I think we are confronting enormous uncertainty. You may not think that this matters much to a country like Australia. And on my way back from Moscow, I was sitting in the Qantas bug smasher flying from Sydney to Canberra, and I picked up the Spirit of Australia magazine, and on page 8 there was an advertisement looking for people to go and work for a company in an LNG plant on northwest Australia. The advertisement said, we're a subsidiary of the Sakhalin Energy Investment Company, and the company that was looking for people is Chiyoda, which is in Yokohama. This is a very different kind of world. We only make 40% of the world's LNG. Think about it. So I think we've got some very serious challenges out there. I'm not sure that our presence in Moscow is what it ought to be a well-informed country facing these sorts of challenges. As a military hand, I always think about intent and capability. I don't think Vladimir Putin has much self-doubt about his intent. I think that he is very ready to make tough decisions if they're needed. Capability, yes. I remember the pictures of our first RAN ship visit to Vladivostok. It was a crying shame to see a former fleet as rusting hulks. That's not so anymore. So those capabilities are on the up and up. And we saw, of course, the presence of those Russian ships off the Australian coast not that long ago. So our world is changing significantly, it's changing dramatically quickly, and we need to be much better informed about the sorts of decisions we need to make for the future. Thank you.
Well, Chris, thank you. If I can ask our three speakers to come and take a seat on the podium, and I will stay here to moderate some 10-15 minutes worth of questions and answers. I'm going to exercise the moderator's right to ask the first question myself, but I'm hoping everyone here will prepare themselves with some focused and brief questions to ask our speakers. My question to the three of you is to ask if you can reflect a little bit on the decision-making style of President Putin. I mean, is it simply oversimplifying and reaching for cultural stereotypes to sort of attribute to him the kinds of decision-making styles that we saw in the Soviet days, or indeed in the earlier days of Russian history, around the need to show strength and in some ways to exhibit sort of gambling behaviour? Or are there sort of deeper personal drivers that inform how he makes decisions?
It's been passed straight to me. Look, I think this is one of the key challenges in working out how he makes decisions, and I don't think any of us have got all the, have got the it's a non-transparent process, so I don't think all of us have got, any of us have got the insights. One of the, for those people that are interested in Russia, you should all be listening to the Power Vertical, which is a blog from RFE-RL. It's brilliant. It's called the Power Vertical for a reason. I mean, the Power Vertical is a key part of the way Russia is being governed. It is everything flows up to the boss in terms of policy and quite often in terms of implementation. Where it gets interesting is what happens when he's got the decision in front of him, and I think that's the bit that's unclear to us. I've had different conversations. I mean, there are clearly only a very small handful of people that he listens to and respects in any way. There's a whole lot of people that are in the government, and many of them are very, very bright. And I don't think I've come across such a batch of incredibly talented young bureaucrats as I came across in, say, the central bank or the finance ministry or the Agency for Strategic Initiatives, or all sorts of, there are. This is a country with immense intellectual capital and just human capital. And many of them are Western educated. They have all the right ideas on what to do, and they've got all the plans and they're ready to go, so long as they can get a sign off from the top. And of course, that's where the process of economic reform is falling down, is the unwillingness to actually push the button and really do it. The best we can get is that there's maybe 4 or 5 people in the inner circle that are advising him on most things. And I suppose the most interesting thing is how he makes decisions. I had some Russians who know, or who have as good an insight as anybody else, say that the level of distrust in the information that he's receiving can be such a challenge that it's actually more effective to brief him by posing a set of questions to him, the answers to which, once he's asked the questions, the answers will lead him to the conclusion, rather than say, here's our recommendations for you on the basis of the facts that we've presented, because he doesn't trust the facts and he doesn't trust the recommendations. But if you lead him through a process of questioning, you may actually get to the right spot, which is intriguing, and it may come from his background.
That's fascinating.
I just want to add, I think that we ought to understand that the nature of decision making in the Russia of today would be very different from decision making in the Soviet Union days.
No.
And I think, as has been suggested, I think there's more of the personality involved in this decision making than there was in the former Soviet Union.
Mm-hmm.
So if you looked at the relationship between Medvedev and Putin, for example, the few people that I spoke to dismissed Medvedev as he's just doing as he's told. Here's the power behind this is the throne. This is the really, my words, the old Tsar at work.
Yeah, and I think you'll find that in the Soviet period, the members of the Politburo and the alternate members, the records show that whilst a reasonably dominant figure like Brezhnev had power, he had to listen to the advice that was given to him. I think the final point I'd make is before we went to Moscow, a very senior Australian intelligence official who's a friend of yours and mine said, "Paul, can you find out what makes this Putin tick, because we don't know." And then he said, "Neither do the Americans nor the Brits, because we've run down our Russian expertise."
Yeah.
Well, ladies and gents, over to you. I've got a question. Yep. And just hang on for a moment until we'll get a mic to you.
I think I can project.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Happy. I'm a student from the ANU. With your hypothetical
invokes Article 5 because Russia does something. To what extent do we actually think that it's in the US's interest to drop Asia and mobilize resources to Central Europe, particularly considering that the channels of communication and the rules of engagement that were present in the Cold War are now sort of eroded, and that increases uncertainty and risk of nuclear warfare?
Yeah. I think that's an interesting one. As big a military power as America is, there are limits. There are limits to all military capabilities, including Australia, by the way. When we boast about, 54 times in the white paper, we're going to support the global rules-based order, oh really? And that we can make a difference. Where? In Ukraine? I don't think so. So we need to cut our cloth, and even America has to do that. And as the Admiral was saying, and he's been talking to some very senior Americans recently, what's happening in America with Trump, just imagine. Just think the unthinkable. Because we couldn't think the unthinkable about the country of my birth, and I was there when it happened last Friday, and everybody was gobsmacked, you know? So the unthinkable can happen. If America, is still bogged down, as it has been now for, 15 years in the Middle East, as we are, and it is struggling with the pivot to Asia even now, imagine what happens if the Russian tanks roll into Tallinn. It would be a level of threat and resources that America has not experienced since at least the Korean War and maybe the Second World War. And there's the problem.
Can I just, this is an interesting challenge because, we do need to think about it. The first thing that we need to say is don't worry about what the US is going to do. The only reason we should move is if we see a unified European response. If Europe's got to be willing to stand to fight the fight at the end of the day. And this was the same strategy we had with sanctions. Canada was out there sanctioning everything. They've got their own domestic electoral reasons why Ukraine is a key issue for them. And the US sort of was following. And the Australian decision was very much to stay sort of mid-peloton amongst the European Union. We weren't going to get out ahead of Europe. Europe had to decide what their appetite for resisting Russia was. And we were going to be supportive at that same level. And I think that's, frankly, the same way we would look at this. The other thing I think it's very important to two other things. One, I think Putin is very good at just staying under the trigger level. He's not trying to bring on a global conflict. He will lose it. He understands he will lose it. It'll be at huge cost, but he knows he will lose. So he's not trying to trigger something like this. So all the niggle that goes on, it is designed to stay just under the trigger level. And then the final thing is we get to choose the battlefield we meet them on. And we always need to remember that. And we should not choose Eastern Europe. We should choose financial transactions. The nuclear option of our resistance to Russia is switching off SWIFT and completely crashing the Russian economy in one swoop. And that was on the cards as part of the sanctions debate. Have we got to the stage where we just turn off SWIFT? And we all pushed back on that. No, we're not at that stage because that is a nuclear option. So there are lots of, it's not the old days of tanks meet tanks. You choose the battlefield you meet them on. We do not beat them with tanks in the Baltics. We meet them with financial disruption that can be very, very brutal.
That's the classic difference, as you know, between the Department of Defence approach and the foreign
I would just finish off by saying it's all about vulnerabilities and assessments of risk. Niggles, it looks like, but things don't stay where they are. And if we are not prepared to show some strength in what we believe in, that will be assessed as a serious weakness. I think it's a bit of a stretch right now to say that anything might happen to invoke Article 5, but at the end of the day, everyone will act in their own best interest as they see it. The United States, that would mean looking at Europe, and as Peter said, would Europe be prepared to stand on these things? These are all very serious questions. Where would we be on the fringe of this? Again, our own self-interest, whatever that looks like. One should never underestimate the forces of nationalism. We are seeing a world in which forces of nationalism are playing a greater role. We're a long way from the end of the Second World War, and we have forgotten what war of that scale really looks like. And you can see it being played out everywhere at the moment.
Now, I'm going to extend by about 4 or 5 minutes to get a couple more questions. So one from our friends from the Russian Embassy, and then I'll come to you for the last question.
First of all, I must stress that all those imposed hysteria about assumed Russian invasion of Baltic states is totally irrelevant. And I don't have any facts that can justify such establishing, because all this event is based on something that is not going to happen. First thing. Second thing, I'm really surprised that up to now I failed to hear any ideas about practical cooperation with Russia. And even the idea of dialogue is based on the terms of de-escalation and treating Russia as an enemy. How are we, probably we should more concentrate in cooperation, not in treating Russia as an enemy. Because it's really strange that even former ambassador to Russia failed to announce any ideals of cooperation. Don't you think it will be the best way of ensuring mutual trust between countries and between Russia and USA, Russia and Australia?
Well, our visit to Moscow was in fact part of that. As I said to your ambassador, I initiated the talks in the early to mid-1980s when I was last at the ANU, and they were difficult times with enormous tension, the likes of which most people in this room have never experienced. And yet we had the talks, and at very high levels. So reinstituting these talks, and we've signed an MOU with RIAC, I think is important. It would be useful, and I understand there are different views on this, if the next time we go, we have talks with the Security Council, with the Foreign Ministry, and with some others. And as you know, that did not happen.
Well, actually, as far as I know, there was a meeting of the Minister of Defense and Australia and partners was given invitation to one of the huge conferences in Russia.
Yeah, but the Security Council did not occur, and neither did the Foreign Ministry at a high level. But, you know, you're right, we should be talking, and that's important. And I'm sure...
Actually, I'm talking about practical cooperation, not about just political dialogue.
Well, we discussed the prospects for practical cooperation in the ASEAN Regional Forum, where I've been pushing the idea of a multilateral avoidance of maritime incidents at sea, and we now have an active study, and we've invited your side, the Russian side, to contribute to that, because you have a lot of experience in it.
Paul Myler, did you want a few seconds on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, just to say, I mean, I just completely disabuse you of any idea that there's not practical cooperation going on. I mean, you know, in a situation of such conflict where, you know, we've got 38 of our citizens laying in a field in Ukraine, or, you know, met their demise in a field in Ukraine, we are still trying to work with Russia. We're trying to work with Russia on counterterrorism, despite, and I should say, you know, so we need to be clear about sanctions. The Western sanctions target defence exports, which none of us actually buy. You know, the countries that are imposing the sanctions don't actually buy Russian arms. Some tweaking of ability of capital in to banks, which was tough, and changing the Arctic, or changing Russia's ability to access Arctic and deep sea oil. So putting something that's about 20 years off, maybe 25 or 30 years off. So there's very limited tangible impact from Western sanctions. There's two things that happened because we put on those sanctions. One, it acted as a massive signal to the market, and frankly, everybody had already lost their appetite for Russia exposure. So So Western banks don't give Russian banks capital, not because the sanctions prevent them, but because they don't want Russia exposure. In fact, they could work around the sanctions. And the biggest impact on inflation in Russia was actually then the Russian government self-imposing a ban on imports of foodstuffs. That's the big impact. Now, nevertheless, so Australian beef, for example, was immediately banned. Fortunately, as long as it's on four legs and mooing, it's okay. So we have a huge export of live cattle to Russia at the moment. And so we have great, the Russian consumer is still getting Australian beef. They love it, they lap it up, it's going very well. So the trade is still there. Mining services, technology, still a huge Australian presence, doing very well. Orica has, invested $400 million has a $400 million contract in Russia. So there's a lot happening still. And there are areas where we would love to see Russia cooperate. We're seeing it around Syria. We'd still like to see it around, obviously, the joint investigation onto MH17.
Thank you.
And we did talk about exchanges of students from each country to the other. Early days, we haven't got anything concrete to report yet, but it's out there as an item of conversation.
Thanks, Chris. Last question.
Hi, my name is Oksana, first name. My last name is Reid. I've lived in Australia for about 17 years now. Born in Kazakhstan to a Ukrainian dad and a Mongolian mum. Now my family lives in the Kaliningrad region. I'm sure you all three know where it is.
Indeed we do.
So I have an absolute true blue Aussie daughter, so she doesn't speak a word of English. Russian, only English. I wish she didn't speak any English at times. So I'm a little bit stuck between the two worlds, as you can imagine. I sort of understand every time I go back home, I can see the nationalistic pride and the absolute popularity that Putin enjoys back in Russia, including my very own immediate family who vote for him religiously.
Yep.
But also I understand where Australia is coming from. I think from my experience, I think the ties should be more economic, because when there are economic, when there's an economic pain in one place, it inevitably translates to pain in somewhere like Australia. It's actually not the beef that suffered, I understand, it's the kangaroo exports.
The kangaroo was pretty small anyway, but...
It was, but my understanding is that was a massive impact on the making of the Russian sausages. So my question to all three of you is, what does Australia do? Because it is in my personal interest, say, to ensure that Australia and Russia do maintain good relationships. And the one very concerning thing that I have seen going back home was, for the first time, I have heard military, grenades going off in the Baltic Sea. For the first time that my family has lived there, and that's 20 years now. So after migrating from Kazakhstan after the USSR breakup. So that's, the concentration power of military in Kaliningrad region, that's extending there. China on our side, and I want to know what Australia exactly, the practical measures that Australia is doing to address that, that divide between the two countries. Because I have to be honest, the question that I was asked when I do have a security clearance, believe it or not, the question that I was asked was, if there was ever a war between Russia and Australia, who would you go for? And I laughed because I said, that's never going to happen.
That's a very diplomatic answer. I think my other colleagues will have different views on this. One of the themes I've been pushing is that we have run down our expertise on Russia. In the Cold War, I worked with a man called Harry Rigby, whose son Richard came with us to Moscow. We had serious expertise on the Soviet Union at the ANU and on some other universities. When I worked in the intelligence in the mid to late 70s, especially if at the height of the Cold War, we took the Soviet Union very seriously. The then Secretary of Defense, Sir Arthur Tang, instructed me to visit the Soviet Union to talk about their naval presence in the Indian Ocean. And I'll never forget, as I walked out of the office, he said to me, "Son," I was about 35, "come back here. I want an Australian view of this Soviet Union place, not an American or British one." I walked out singing Hallelujah. We don't have enough of that. It is not a state secret, or as we used to say in the Soviet Union, as is well known, ONA has one person that handles Russia and the whole of Europe. Excuse me. And I'm told that that applies also in America and in Britain. And you see, Chris's point about hubris, and my colleague here may have a different view on this, there was undoubtedly American hubris. We won the Cold War. No, you didn't. The Soviet Union disintegrated. The Soviet Union could have continued on for several more decades. Look at North Korea. Look at Cuba. But hubris set in, and whether we agree or not on Marshall Plan, the fact is that moving NATO troops onto the very borders, you can say that any country has a democratic right to do that. Let me tell you as a former defence planner how different the world looks from a Department of Foreign Affairs view. So the nearest NATO military airfield in Estonia to Petersburg is the distance from Canberra to Cooma. I can tell you right now, even given our good relations with Indonesia, if we had Indonesian fighter aircraft in Cooma, we would have a slight problem. But
Unless they were there on a skiing holiday.
The issue of doing more about studying Russia is very, very important.
Okay, so other Paul and Chris, any brief final comments from you?
Sure. Well, maybe look. I don't want to end this on a really down note. Okay, so I'm going to say something a little bit controversial. What we need to remember is that Russia is an incredibly young country. Okay, it's a very old culture, but a country, it is extremely young, right? Unlike the Baltics or Eastern Europe, there's no lived memory, or there was no lived memory, there certainly isn't anymore, of what a normal civic society looked like. Right? The Baltics could remember, Grandma still remembered how the market used to run. In Eastern Europe, there was still lived memory at the end of the Cold War. There was no lived memory in Russia. Okay, it's all of that was wiped. And then there was no real process of detotalitarianisation or reconciliation with what happened in the Soviet Union. That's still to come. That hasn't happened yet. So it's a very young country, and it's struggling. It's also full of incredibly talented young people who really do know what they're doing. There was a repat generation that we met because of mixing with school communities and things like that. These were young Russians who left in the 90s, spent 10 years working in New York or wherever, and had come back. Their parents were elderly. They wanted their kids to be raised in Russia. These people were incredible, dynamic, knew exactly what they were doing. Unfortunately, a lot of them have left now because they've seen that the opportunities that they came back for are disappearing. But they're still there. They still want to be in Russia. Okay, so these are very, very talented people. I mean, the cooperation that we had, when we talk about cooperation, the cooperation that we had on the G20, the Australia-Russia cooperation, was incredible. I mean, we were in each other's pockets. We knew exactly what we were doing. We worked together right through 2013, right through 2014, regardless of MH17, regardless of Ukraine, regardless of everything else. That relationship never skipped a beat. Never skipped a beat.
Okay, Paul, I'm
so
going
we
to stop
can
you
do
there.
it.
Chris, last one.
Right, very quickly, we should never forget about the US response to Cuba way back when. Think about recent circumstances. So there was a time when we did the same sort of thing. Secondly, I was very impressed about the reading culture in Russia. There was a huge literary festival taking place in Red Square, and we went up there and people of all ages were enjoying the opportunity to participate. You don't see it in our society much longer. We're television people and we're social media people. But this idea of reading, and we went to Globus Biblio, and again the place was absolutely jam-packed full of people who read. So solid old culture, what do families talk to each other about, all those sorts of things are enormous cultural strength in a country like that.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I know this is an audience that, I'll not take the question, this is an audience that does read, particularly ASPI product, and I hope that each of you make sure to take a copy of Paul's new book away. I think we can say it's been well and truly launched, and I'd ask you to thank our three speakers. And now we can continue our conversation over a glass of wine and some snacks. Please make yourselves available.